Reid Hoffman is currently the chairman and president of LinkedIn, and I'll let him, to the degree he chooses, tell you about LinkedIn, but it is one of the successes of the last few years. And he's going from success to success. Prior to that, he was deeply involved in PayPal and its sale to eBay, and I only can envy the numbers of zeros involved in those transactions, and so I shall sit here in the corner envious while he talks. One way or another, I'm sure it'll be a compelling speech. Reid Hoffman.
Thank you. So hopefully, at least a few of the things I will say will be interesting or provocative enough to stimulate a bit of thinking. One always has difficulty assessing what would be interesting or unique for a specific audience, and given that I spend most of my life in Silicon Valley, kind of figuring out what the right translation is tricky. The LinkedIn URL, I'm not going to talk about LinkedIn a whole lot, is the personal URLs we give. So if you actually want a very deep bio of me, you can go take a look at that. Here are the questions that I'm going to be addressing. I'm going to try to leave a bit of room at the end for some Q&A from the audience. But the first question is, why is this topic interesting? Because in one sense, if you actually look at classic kind of internet business as a media business, and media business is advertising, why don't you just say, well, look, it's how and when to monetize it, you put some advertising on it, you're done. The second question is why that question is actually non-optimal for a strategy in terms of how you execute building either an online digital community as a startup or a large company. Where is innovation here going to be interesting? And what are the differences between the ways in which startups can tackle this question and established companies can tackle this question? So the apparent answer for most times when you're dealing with business models is start your revenue soon or immediately, grow the business with the revenue. So you can figure out how well you're investing in something because you can tell how well you're monetizing it as you go. And that, as I mentioned earlier when I was going through the questions, digital communities look a lot like media properties. They have all the attributes that one talks about these things in are things like reach, demographics, time on site, page views is kind of the old metric, but that sort of thing. And then those things most naturally align to advertising concepts. And the apparent answer in terms of why the topic is interesting is that economics for digital communities currently seem quite low. If you look at, for example, the CPM rates that things like MySpace and Facebook get, it seems like it's a very low CPM, and there should be some way of elevating it. And similarly to this normal wisdom, it's the strategic angle that you would expect to take would be similar between startups and large companies. However, I don't think that that's actually, the apparent answers are actually particularly good. I actually think that generally speaking, when you're doing a business strategy, you actually focus on putting in what I call revenue placeholders. You don't actually focus on really how fully you can maximize the revenue, and sometimes actually you put in 2 or 3 placeholders. And I'll talk about some of the different options, I think. And I'm aware that there's more stuff that goes on here with games than Silicon Valley, so I'll talk a little bit about that too. But you put it, what I mean by placeholders is, for example, if you decide you're going to do advertising, you put it in Google AdSense at the beginning, just so that your consumers are familiar it's there, but you're actually not trying to prove your revenue model. You're actually just trying to get a little bit of money on the side while you're actually building out your business. And then what you focus on is growing your audience massively. And part of the reason that, if you actually look at it in terms of perspective, is pretty simple, which is if you have 10 million users times a certain amount that you can monetize per user, you actually have any innovation or change that you can do in terms of monetization per user has a great impact. Whereas if you only get to 500,000, 1 million, I'm just using these numbers as illustrative, then the degree to which you can switch your change your monetization strategy effectively doesn't have as much impact in terms of your revenue. And then this is probably the most important thing that I think is key to approaching this strategically, which is plan on the fact that there will be revenue innovation, not just by you, but by the ecosystem of other companies and other properties around you. And one of the things that I think that people most often make mistakes when they are planning their product or business or corporate strategy is they more or less presume that the entire world is static. Some versions of this mistake are that you presume your competitors are static. You presume your competitors are not, in fact, building new things, trying to make launches. But another version of it is all aspects of what goes on the internet and online are actually subject to innovation. People are trying to innovate all parts of them, trying to innovate how you distribute and get to an audience and customers. They're trying to innovate on technologies of engagement. And also they're trying to innovate on revenue. And you yourself will try to do that, but you can also draft of what other people are doing. The next thing is I actually think there's multiple paths to monetization, which of course include advertising, and advertising may in fact be the principal economic resource for most brands of what you would call digital communities. I guess I should pause for a moment of definition. I look at a digital community as any time where you have tons of people signed up online and interacting with each other. It can be anything from obviously a multiplayer game, a massive multiplayer game, to lots of chat rooms and message boards, to social networks. And but what I think one of the interesting things is if you actually look at how most of these communities monetize through advertising now, I think everyone would agree that the advertising will require innovation. So like the big announcements by MySpace and Facebook earlier in the, I guess it was last month, earlier this month, they did it the first week of November, is they're saying, well, we've got this new concept, which is we have massive amounts of user-registered data for better profile targeting, whether it's the geography they're in, their age, gender, these sorts of things, and then we can make this as across the network advertising. We can raise CPMs with this and generate an advertising network, and that's how we will effectively make money. And that's an attempt at innovation. Whether or not that approach will work in a straightforward manner, I think is still TBD. But what this makes is it makes the topic interesting because what you do is you actually don't need to drive your strategy with an immediate, I don't have to absolutely understand how to monetize now, right? It always makes people a little nervous, right? Because, well, what happens if 2 years from now we figure out how to, we invested a bunch of money, sweat equity, all these sorts of things, we built an interesting digital community, and now we can't figure out how to monetize. It's very frustrating. But that's actually the nature of building new products. That's the nature of innovation. That's the nature of doing startups, which is you're taking a gamble anyway. And the question is what's the rational order of gambles that you should take? And almost always, I tend to think that in building community properties online, the very first rational gamble to focus on is how do you get to massive engagement, a massive number of users. So for example, when I'm talking to prospective entrepreneurs for consumer internet stuff, I say, look, the first two questions I'm interested in are how do you get to your first 1 million users, and then how do you get to 10 million users? And I'm not even interested in talking about business model until I believe the answer to that question. And part of how that plays out here, and part of what you're trying to do is, there's a limited number of things that you can innovate on very well, and sometimes those change what you're doing. So for example, you may have a very clever business model idea for a digital community, but if you can't get to a large number of users, that's essentially value equals zero, right? So focus on the first problem, which is how do you get to that size, and then focus on the next problem. Now, the metaphor that I frequently use for thinking about this is puzzle pieces. So it's good to have, well, I can use advertising, and there's a way of doing product placement, and there's a way of selling goods inside the virtual world or game, and you can do this, and that gets back to the revenue placeholders as an idea. But you may find that you have to innovate and change a lot in order to get to the distribution. And what happens if you innovated away from all this thought you put into how do I monetize, right? How do I simply abstract value from this thing? And then then that was wasted time because it's off an audience you have. How do you monetize them? Now, so anyway, as I said, actually, one thing I said already was plan on evolution and change. Now, the second piece is plan on dealing with the needs and psychology of the customers. Another thing I frequently say about investing in the consumer internet is you're investing in one of the 7 deadly sins, one or more, right? Because these deal with people's kind of emotional infrastructures. So obviously on the internet, lust is quite popular. The number of bits that go through the internet and pornography are substantial. But there's also sloth, which you could line up with entertainment. This is all, of course, very rough and crude. And when people frequently ask me about LinkedIn with this, I of course answer greed. So, and then the last thing is, what are the available business models? And those will be changing. I think the only thing that is absolutely certain is there will be some new and interesting ones over the next 2 or 3 years. Now, the last piece in terms of the theme of better answers on these things is that startups and large companies most likely need to approach this differently. And I'm going to talk more about this on a slide in a few minutes, so I'm not going to linger on it here, but usually because I think the problem looks the same, the solution set and how you play the game between the two companies is the same, and actually I don't think it is. So the arguments for the apparent thesis are, and I put these out here because there are actually some good reasoning behind why people usually choose door A rather than the door B I'm recommending, is if you monetize soon or immediately, you get the community acclimatized to how you're expecting to engage with money. Usually a community actually also worries about that if you're not apparently making money in some way, that you're probably going to try to do something heinous, like sell all their data to spammers or something terrible. So getting them acclimatized to the fact there is a business model here is a useful thing. I refer back to, this is one of the reasons I was saying revenue placeholders are usually a very good idea in the beginning. Obviously getting the businesses self-sustaining means that the capital investment cost is a lot lower. And then getting into a cycle where you get revenue and then reinvestment creates a naturally sustaining system. And if you're on the right track, which is one of the things that people I think are most frequently desirous of in terms of psychology. And it's nice to know. They tend to say advertising is a revenue stream because a lot of time on site, attention engagement, classic media metrics, demographics. Communities generally also don't pay for participation. Of course, one of the things that kind of is the more interesting area in terms of the game stuff is like Second Life is buying digital land, right? Or buying new avatars, or dress up your doll and Stardoll. The principal concern is, I think in the apparent thesis is how do you quickly get to establishing whether or not there's a business? And the general reason why I don't think that that's necessarily the concern is because while I think there is some percentage that even if you get to massive engagement, that the later economics won't work out, if you get to massive engagement, get a baseline of economics in so that you're at least sustainable, now you can continue to roll the dice on how well you can get the economics going. You can establish a much better business. So, and as I mentioned, because people think the problem is the same, startups and large companies should execute similar strategies. Now here's some of the background considerations I think as to why I recommend door B. The business strategy that goes with the apparent thesis presumes there's stability in the product offerings, which I think change a lot over every 2 or 3 years. Customer demand, which is evolving, because if you actually think about things like how familiar is the younger generations with mobile, or one of the things I frequently say about privacy issues is that privacy is an old person's game. Because younger generations, for example, will put their cell phone numbers on Facebook in a heartbeat, right? Which horrifies most of the people who are, say, 35 or 40 or older. But it's a different demand. It's a changing, and it's not just year by year as people get older. Because, when I was a student in Oxford from 1993, no one would use mobile phones. You couldn't walk around. And one of the things that was weird about coming back for the first time in 2005 to Silicon Valley, comes to Oxford, was watching everyone walk around with mobile phones, old and young alike, because once that tips, it can actually tip into a large number of people. And so the focus on revenue on these things, and there's changes in available revenue streams and competitive situation, the focus on revenue streams is limiting because you're trying to solve the problem of having massive engagement first. And generally speaking, I think individuals and businesses can only solve one real substantive problem at a time. And usually the rule is focus. And if you actually say, well, It's like, for example, I'm going to prioritize everything, or I'm going to focus on everything across the board is usually a bad answer. So, and for revenue, a massively engaged audience is a prerequisite. Now, here's part of where I start talking about how startups and established companies, or large companies, take different paths to innovation. One of the things you do as a startup is usually when you're financed, you don't have an asset. You have an idea, you have maybe a team, and you're trying to make something work. And so it's okay to gamble at all. It's okay to gamble brand value. You don't really have any brand value right now. It's okay to gamble something really risky that maybe people will really love or hate. Fine, right? And so you take these massive jumps, you risk the business, and part of how the innovation ecosystem works, whether it's for a product and whether or not you can get a distributor to engage, or the revenue model, is that all of these small organisms are innovating on it, and they're trying to create new ideas, and you get a chance to see which of them work. And it's somewhat like a Darwinian ecosystem, and that some of them work out and others don't. Now, part of what this gives established companies a way of looking at this is say, well, part of the problem is both small companies and large companies can only make so many initiatives, per month, per quarter. And even when you get a lot larger and you now have 10,000 employees or 3,000 employees in your company, the number of changes and products you can ship and innovations in the revenue model you can do does not scale linearly with the number of employees. Matter of fact, it kind of asymptotes. And so that means your strategy should be different, right? Which is your strategy is, okay, we're only going to take 2 or 3 moves. We're generally going to do things that are largely proven. But we can look at all these other startups, and one thing you can do is obviously buy them. But another thing you can do is say, oh, that one looks like it's working, I want to do that. And that's part of the reason why I think there's a difference in how the strategic approach is, whether you're a startup or an established company. So I guess at this point, actually, I've mentioned a lot of these things in terms of recommendations on strategy for how to approach this, which is focus on, how do you get to, even if you're doing something that is more easily monetizable, like a game, focus on how do you get to a really large footprint where people are engaged. And one of the things that's interesting about communities is that they generally have what is described as network effects. Now, network effects are frequently overstated, but the basic idea is that the glue that keeps people here in this game, in this chat room, in this network, is the fact that all the other people that this person's associating with are here too, and it's the social interactions and the connectivity that keeps them there. And so there's versions of network effects with instant messaging networks and social networks and that sort of thing. Now, people frequently overstate how valuable network effects are. I distinguish between weak and strong network effects. Weak network effects are ones that, all right, so let's use instant messengers. I'm using AOL Instant Messenger, and I'm not going to stop using AOL because 30 of my buddies are using AOL Instant Messenger. But there's nothing to stop me from also using Yahoo Instant Messenger. So it doesn't have strong network effects, which is I choose one rather than the other. Now, for example, eBay has strong network effects for a certain class of good. It's not all goods. The class of good that eBay has network effects for are unique goods or one-off used goods, these sorts of things, because I can only put them on one marketplace listing. So if I put them on eBay, I don't put them on other places. Now, commodity goods, in fact, don't have network effects at all, because if I've got 1,000 units in my store, my warehouse, I can put them in all kinds of places, and I can sell them anywhere where there's traction for it to move. So part of the thing I think is interesting when you focus on how to get to a large footprint of users, and one of the things that I think is central to how you drive effective strategy online, is a focus on the user experience and focus on an ecosystem of creating a valuable engagement. And part of what I meant by engagement and assets here is assets also come out to a set of things that then derive value for your audience and for you. So obviously, for example, as more people join LinkedIn and as there's more profiles there, then someone who's coming in to do a task with LinkedIn, say for example looking for an expert to help them solve a problem, or a lawyer, or any of these number of searches, maybe searching for people, the more likely there is someone there with a rich profile that you can evaluate and find, like if they're 2 degrees away from you, you can check them out, is in fact more valuable. So, and then expect change and innovation, right? So One of the things is you keep costs low so that you can go longer to take advantage of markets as they evolve or change, especially innovation and revenue model. And then track experiments and results across the internet. So many people, when they're trying to create stuff, focus only on what they're doing. They lose out on essentially this massive ecosystem, which is innovating on all these things all over the place. Now, in terms of driving innovation, it's sometimes difficult to do while you keep the cost structure low. But one of the really key things is there are different kinds of innovation. Some of them risk kind of the fundamental assets of the company, and some of them just kind of risk making you look embarrassed. And one of the pieces of advice I give is be willing to be embarrassed, because it's worth kind of trying something. And experiment with the different possibilities on revenue. So here's kind of a way of breaking out the revenue options. So I look at, and actually I didn't really break out specific stuff on games. It was pointed out to me by a friend of mine here that there's a lot of activity in the game space. I'll talk to you a little bit about it. But advertising also have direct sales, and it's everything from from just banners and text links and whatnot to attempts to make specific things like page takeovers, interstitials, product placements, that sort of thing. There's also almost always some way of trying to get remaindered inventory out there, because one of the general properties that has not been solved yet is in community sites you tend to have a number of users with a huge amount of use, and that runs into problems with inventory caps and that sort of thing, because advertisers only want to advertise to one person in a time unit only so many times. And they're generally less interesting, but experimentation is good, is new ad units like flash inventory and interstitials and whatnot. There's also indirect advertising. We put classifieds on your community. You have what I call e-commerce lead generation, but that can include selling goods or that sort of thing. And affiliate programs for co-reg or other kinds of things where you're getting people to sign up for stuff. Now, current innovations that I've seen on business models that I think are pretty interesting are, there's a site in the US called Fandango. Actually, it's kind of funny to be talking about this in an IMAX theater, which sells tickets online. And actually, they have a fairly substantive revenue stream because Hollywood tries to figure out whether or not they should double down on their marketing budgets on particular films. And one of the things they found that's very predictive is basically, give me good intel on who it is who's purchasing tickets on the opening weekend. Male, female, age, region, demographic, etc. And because Fandango pays for all, has all the tickets bought for with credit cards, they essentially have all this information. So they actually help the studios redirect millions and millions of dollars in advertisements, and then they get a good revenue stream from that. Now, I also think that there's a good possibility on the net on premium models. Generally speaking, a lot of people in Silicon Valley tend to be skeptical of charging customers for the following sort of simple reason, which is that if you could build a feature, why not have the feature being used by the 100 million people using it for free rather than the, say, 5 million people who are paying for it? You get a lot more usage out of the 100 million. So generally speaking, it's kind of like, why build a feature for only 5 million people? Now, at least in the LinkedIn case, part of that's because the things that we do with subscribers are people who are using this as a kind of a serious day-by-day business case, whether it's, as I mentioned, hedge fund people looking for experts, VCs doing due diligence or referencing, recruiters hiring people, job seekers, the whole thing. All of those they have an intense need and they'll expense it, so it works. But generally speaking, one of the things that you have to be careful about is making that decision between free and premium. Now, once, of course, I think in a lot of communities, you get someone engaged and then they want something like a fancier avatar or something else, you could either charge for that or extract some other kind of value. But I think, as I mentioned, there's going to be a ton of innovation in these sorts of areas, and it's one of the things to plan your strategy on, expecting innovation. In terms of startups and large companies, as I mentioned, the innovation approach has to be very different. Startups are kind of all in and okay to die, whereas an established company has a variety of assets, some of them tangible and some of them intangible, like brands, that they just can't put on the line. And one of the things that frequently is funny, because people focus a lot on large companies making innovation, And that can happen, but one of the places where there's kind of an inherent tension is you can't do innovation without risk. Right? There's no way to jump onto something new and not take at least some risk. Now, if the risk is just kind of the egg on your face embarrassment risk, fine, as long as you can take that. But one of the reasons why kind of it requires an ecosystem frequently is it's across a lot of small efforts, and then those things work or don't work. And its ability to change and iterate fast, a willingness to experiment, frequently willingness to experiment translates into willingness to fail. And with startups, you take a big jump, and with large companies, generally thinking, I think it's good to really watch the startup ecosystem. In either of these cases, actually, I think expecting change is good, but in the large companies, it's expecting and then following from startups. So I think the business opportunities in digital communities are likely to be very large because of the nature of the internet medium. You get massive numbers of users and massive amounts of engagement. But I think it requires a participation and tolerance of a large chaotic system. And then, all these things I list here, customer engagement, the competitive landscape, available business models, how fast you need to move, right, all change. And it's actually, in fact, unknown what the future shapes will be. So at this point, I think I'm ready to take some questions, if I haven't surprised the people in the audience too fast. Good. Now I can see you. You guys were spotlights for most of the talk.
Happy micers are coming.
Okay. If you want to speak up and ask a question, I'll repeat it. Anyone?
Well, Hillary, I'll ask one.
All right, go for it.
So, given all the sort of the strategic positioning that you've given, how exactly are you doing it on LinkedIn? In other words, which of your advice are you taking?
Well, we actually took a lot of our advice. So we we launched in May 5th, 2003, and we launched our very first revenue feature in March of 2004. No, 2005, excuse me. I knew it was too quick. And so we were focused on how do you grow the network, how do you build in mechanisms like search and all that sort of thing. And our very first revenue thing actually was job listings. And it wasn't because we were expecting, job listings are not our majority revenue stream even now. It was because it also demonstrated a use case. And so the general focus on the net is how do you get a use case that appeals to a huge majority of your audience. And that's the reason we did that. Then we moved to subscriptions, which is where we knew we would make a bunch of money. And that's the thing that got us to profitability pretty quickly.
Is that your major revenue stream?
That is the major revenue stream, subscriptions. So that's how we do it. And what's more, actually, if you actually look at how everything is constituted right now, I actually expect in the next 2 years, the way that we configure subscriptions, the way that we drive how the job listings give you value, and the way that we do our advertising will all change radically. It will not be the same as it is today.
Okay, before I just wanted, I'm always happy to ask questions the whole time, so if you have a question, bellow. Yep. All right, there you go. While she's going up, I'll ask you a question in the interstitial. One of the things that we were talking about this morning prior to your joining us was the likely impact of video on demand across many, many things. One of the things we didn't talk about, though, is the impact of video on current existing digital communities, where it could also play quite a disruptive role. And one of the things I was wondering about is, isn't that true for LinkedIn as well?
Good question, although the answer is basically no. So one of the things that I find happens a lot in innovation is people take a look at a new technology and then they go, oh, and that'll work really well over here. And so they kind of, instead of mapping onto a consumer need or something they can do, they're mapping on a solution. And so over the last 3 years, I've been pitched with this brilliant new idea, video resumes, right? And it's like, you haven't thought of this. Let me tell you what this great idea, no, it's a special IP I don't want to let anyone know. And you're like, okay, right? And video resumes are basically a bad idea. Not never, and not, I couldn't see the market evolving to having them in a certain range of how people find people and recruit people, but they're like voicemail rather than email is one problem. So they're hard to consume. It's kind of this thing. In the U.S., there's all these issues around. You're not. I mean, this is the difference in Europe and the U.S. But in the U.S., you're not allowed. most HR departments of large companies, if you send your picture in with your CV, they throw the picture away immediately, because if they don't, they fall under equal opportunity law. And you have to handle the resume in a very particular way, because you're supposed to be agnostic to such things as gender, race, age, and whatnot, all of which become very immediately apparent in the picture. And the videos run into the same problem. And so, and what's more, one of the things, generally speaking, in terms of, and this is one of the ways that LinkedIn is revolutionizing recruiting, is the whole recruiting model by which you post a listing and then people apply for it is a retarded model that comes from newspaper days, ultimately. Not saying newspapers are retarded, just that was the technology medium before. And this is like saying, okay, the way that I want to recruit the person I want to do this is I'm going to put a sign out in front and hope someone sees it and hope that they apply for it and they're right. You want to go find the right person to help you do that, right? And one of the things the internet allows everyone to have a professional profile so that you go find the right person to do that. And I think that's the way that recruiting will actually go. Now, the problem, of course, in this thing with putting a video resume up right now is that a video resume sends the wrong signal, right? You don't actually want to send the signal, I'm looking, or I might be looking. You're saying, look, I'm doing business. You find me, fine me. You don't find me, don't find me. I'm just a professional, I'm doing business.
Okay, I think you've completely answered their question. No, it's fantastic. There's a question up here, I believe, on the right.
Hello, yeah, Mike Butcher from TechCrunch. You have signed up to the Google Open Social platform. What made you guys sign up to that as opposed to, say, I don't know, doing a deal with Facebook and doing an application style play with Facebook as opposed to the Google thing?
Well, so one thing is that the Facebook platform wasn't or isn't really on offer. The second thing is part of the definition. We were pretty early conversational participants in the Open Social program because they wanted to get a wide variety of important networks on, and we kind of lead the way on the professional side. And basically, one of the things that was a key thing for Google persuading me was that they're actually doing it as kind of it's not they control how the APIs evolve. It's a industry consortium that will do that, and that's pretty useful. And the second thing was we walked the tech plans to make sure that if you wanted to, you could implement it completely free of kind of Google servers or Google access. And that's another part that makes open useful. Now, from LinkedIn's perspective, open social APIs are good but partial, because a lot of the APIs are things that are useful for social networks, which are things like, hey, give me a friends list and give me their birthdays and let me send them cards and that kind of stuff. Most of the LinkedIn APIs are things like, for example, let me find an insider at this company so that I can approach them to do a business development deal, that sort of thing. So we've actually had a set of APIs that we're working on to expand on the professional side as well. But it's a good basic set, and the fact that it was open and the fact that it was better for developers to be able to build it as one thing, and it was essentially not one company controlling it, were all the factors that led to our getting on board.